So, first of all, thank you very much to the conference organizers and for your patience, for the ability to come and talk today. So this is an 80-page document. It's been summarized into 20 minutes. So seat backs and tray tables in the upright position, belts securely fastened. We're about to take off. But before I want to do that, time is very precious, but really I got a shout out to Oliver and Joanna and Sign last night for such a wonderful, memorable gala. Of the 40 years that I've been going to these sorts of things, that one really sticks out. So I don't know if I'm supposed to go this way. All right, so there we go. Is it your damn lice that are getting on my wild fish? Let's find out. First of all, the disclaimer's up there because let's be real. Somebody's got to pay for me coming here, and I thank my wife for letting me dip into the corporate funds to cover the majority of it. But the organizations that supported this were the We Become First Nations, also known as the Campbell Indian Band, that supported me in the analysis of the secondary analysis of the data. Greek Seafoods that opened up the books and gave me all free access to their data, and also kicked in for some travel assistance, and Cermak Canada that shared their data and also gave me some travel. They did not have editorial license on this, so they let me have free reign of this to form my own opinions. So here's the claim. We've all seen these pictures of Chumley that gets around from year to year, covered in lice, that sea lice from the farm salmon are directly infesting wild migratory juvenile salmon in British Columbia. Here's the infection paradigm, and as we can see that we've got chum salmon that are returning that are lousy. Now they're transferring adult fish directly to those in the pens. They're producing eggs, nauplii, copeptids that are infecting those. And then over the winter, that this is forming an incubation facility for lice, and it's multiplying them and shedding them. So when those smolts come down the stream, nice and naive and clean and fresh, they swim past the farms. They either directly pick up the adults or they end up getting infected by copeptids. So that's how they do it. And the cycle then repeats itself. They go and they pick up more, bring it back to the farms, etc. So to be perfectly clear on this, the fish in the cages are lousy. The wild juvenile salmon are coming out of the freshwater free of lice. They're swimming past the pens, and they're even jumping on with the adult lice, or they're getting infected as they swim by. So the question is, are those lice on the farm salmon really the progenitors of the lice that we're finding in wild salmon? Let me introduce the industry in British Columbia for a little bit, whatever's left of it. There are three main producers, which is Mowi Canada East, that has 35,000 tons of production, now down to 23,000 because these sites are all closed. Cermak Canada was about the same, and they've dropped. Greek Seafoods is actually picking up. They're getting a few more sites. So in about the early aughts, we leveled off at about 75,000 tons, now down about 60. So we produce in all of British Columbia what's being done in a few fjords out here. This study that I've done is going to focus, this is Vancouver Island. These red dots are all locations of different salmon farms, and you saw a very similar one to this with Lance's presentation. We're going to focus on three areas. One is the Nootka Esperanza, indicative of the West Coast sites. Then the Discovery Island sites, which had a high intensity of farms at one time. And then this is a little tucked away on the Vancouver mainland inlets is sea shells. So those three areas, West Coast, Nootka Esperanza, sea shells, and the Discovery Islands. So I had to ask the questions to myself, looking at all of these data, looking at what we were supposed to be looking at, is how many adult lice on the farm salmon during migration. Because if they're going to be jumping off, we've got to have adult lice that are there. Secondarily to that, is there going to be how many egg-bearing females are there? Because it's going to be they that produce the eggs, the nauplii, and the copeptids that are going to be infecting those fish. Then how long do those migratory salmon, in their journeys, do they hang around the farms long enough to get, oh, I'm getting itchy? Or is it they just scoot on by? How does that look? And then if that's not the case, if there's other villains that are happening, who are they and where do they live? BC's known for its salmon. We've got a lot of wild salmon. In fact, we've got more places without fish farms with salmon than we do places with salmon farms and wild fish. So there's got to be places out there that have got lice on salmon because those two have evolved throughout the millennia. Maybe there's a contribution from farms that's hidden in the background that's amplified things, but there's still these pristine areas. So I wanted to look at, are there any surveys that have been done in those pristine areas of wild fish with lice on them? And it turns out that there has. So what I was trying to do here is I'm trying to say, is there a background infection and how are we going to measure it? What is that value? You know, what you don't measure, you don't know. So I did find some stuff. And here we are that in the Skeena watershed, which is about latitude 52 by the Alaska Panhandle, that if you take pinks and chums into account, caligus and leps, we end up with a 0.05 to 0.2 abundance, so lice per fish. On the Central Coast, which is down a little bit further, halfway between in the American border and the top of Vancouver Island, that changes a little bit higher, so that it's about 0.3 to 0.6. Then we look at areas of Nootka Sound that have lots of salmon, but no fish farms in these long inlets, and that level seems to be about 0.5 in pinks and chums on that. And in the Broughton Archipelago, there's areas there at the end of inlets that don't have any salmon farms on them, and they get measured out, and they're about 0.2 to 0.5. So there are areas that we've got salmon and we've got lice without salmon farms. So we're going to be taking that level at 0.2 lice per fish. That's going to be my background. Like it or not, that's going to be the benchmark for now. We can change that. So that's based on all of the literature and the sampling programs. But also, we wanted to consider waters around Vancouver Island that don't have any farms, that spatially isolated from farms, that have farms removed, that are decommissioned, or they're fallow. So let's take that all into consideration, and we come up with that 0.2 lice per fish. So we'll keep that in mind. Now the data sets, as Lance has presented on Monday, was the Aquaculture Stewardship Council, and it deals with the wild salmon. Department of Fisheries Oceans do both the farms, and they do wild salmon. And so their literature, or their data are available publicly. And then there's the salmon farm data monitoring programs, which are extensive. So that includes the DFO Fish Health Monitoring Program and their data, their compliance, and they record by the number of lice per fish, the life stage and species in representative samples. I consider only LEPs, and the reason is that caligus is not only hard to quantify, life stage, etc. It's not the benchmark for regulatory aspects of it. There's some issues around that, but really we don't know if it's going to cause death by left. And if you try and measure it, you pick up it jumps off. So how do you know? I've focused on chum salmon, and the reason is because there's the body of evidence is around chum salmon. It's got a really good data set that stands up to stats. They're predictable in their runs, and they're predictable defined in their location, so they can be sequentially and annually sampled. So they give us good longitudinal data. Pink salmon, although they're really nice, they only spawn. Their runs are every 2 years. They spawn every year, but it depends on where they are. You don't know who's coming through, and the numbers aren't there. And I'll show you some data where there's absolute absence of that. And we could go on about this, but the talk's only 20 minutes, so we could talk about other fish if we wanted to. How are we going to test the regularness of the paradigm? And that's that during the migration of those juvenile salmon, we got to compare the annual longitudinal data for lice on wild and farm salmon. So let's look at what those counts are over 20 years in some cases. And then compare the life stage data. Remember, these are recorded when they're captured, of what stage of the lice is on the fish and how big the fish is and the temperature and the salinity of the area that it was caught. So all of those parameters. And then we're going to look at other contributing factors. So data dump, here it goes. This is the publicly available data, and this is from the DFO from 3 different regions. The dotted line on all of these is the regulatory limit. Now, it may look tragic to you to see that these big peaks that are happening in September, October, November, December, keep in mind that you do not have to keep to the regulatory limits if you're harvesting your fish. And as those fish go in the spring, 18 months later, they're coming out in those months. Also, We've got chum salmon that are coming back during that period of time. Nobody's measured what the counts are on the wild chum salmon, and that's a big variable that's in that, and that's something we really need to do. But it's implied, if the paradigm is valid, that they're jumping off. That could be some of the response for these peaks that are happening. But generally speaking, for the third of the year during the migratory aspect of it, we've got low counts of lice on fish within the pens, and those are usually the lower. Mostly they don't exceed 1 louse per fish in those areas. And they're kept down there on purpose. So there's treatment and there's barriers that are used. Let's get to the real data, and this is for the Jervis Inlet. So this is in the area that's on the mainland coast. If we look at 16, I don't know what happened there, El Nino year, you got me. But over the years, this is the abundance of these fish. So the average is about 0.24 for all of the lice on wild chum salmon in the Jervis Inlet where farms are present. If we look at the Nootka Sound, where there's a whole body of evidence, and Crawford Revy has published his analysis on this, and within sample variance in many cases is greater than between sample variances in measuring. Sites changed, locations changed, all sorts of stuff. But we got some data. Whopper year in 2020, bad lice year. That was when the blob was off the coast of the island. I don't know if that was the case or not. But what we can see is there's no pattern. Even if you use that very scientific analytical aspect of squint and make them fuzzy, it still doesn't tell you that there's a pattern. There's some ups, there's some downs. But if you throw out this one, it's 0 lice per fish. If you keep this one in, it's 0.15 lice per fish on wild chum salmon, LEPs on wild chum salmon. If we look at the lice that are on the farm salmon in Jervis Inlet, again, no real pattern. In this year and 21, there was no fish, no lice on these farms, and there was smolts in this year. But really what we see is it's generally higher from 0.1 to 1.4 to 0.24. So it's a once above 1 lice per fish and an average of 0.7. So this is the farm fish during that migratory period of February to May. In Nootka, same sort of pattern that we see, and I'll show you a comparison in a minute, but it's up to 4 times higher in certain years from the wild fish. And again, it's variable year to year with no clear pattern from it. Also, something that I can't tease out, and that Crawford found as well, is we don't know because of harvest, because those limits were lifted. Were they allowed to have more lice on those harvest fish? So it really skews what's going on in those years. But the average abundance was 1.5, which is 10 times higher than the wild. So we have 10 times higher on the farm fish than we do on the wild fish. Now we put them together. What I'm doing here is looking at the adult female lice with eggs. Is that good? Got that right there? Anyway, no. All life stages from the Jervis Inlet site. So the green is the farm fish, the blue is the wild fish, and what we see in every instance where they're compared is that we have higher counts on the farm fish than we do on the wild fish. But even in the absence of any farm fish on the farm, or even post-smolts, even then it's still higher, there's still lice on those fish. There's still lice on the wild fish in the absence of farm fish. Nootka is a little bit different. We can see that, again, a great difference. Notice the scales here are 1.5 times greater, or 4 times greater, for the wild fish, which are in orange, and the blue are the counts on the farm fish. So this scale for farm, this scale for wild. We can see that there's, roughly the same sort of association, but no pattern, and it doesn't look to be, and there isn't, a direct relation between the gaps there. So I couldn't link up that a predictive indices to say if I had this much on farm, I'm going to get this much on wild. It just fell apart. So again, there's no significant trend. So in generalities, when we're starting to compare those abundance levels, the first part of testing where that lice coming from is that there's no clear pattern of association between that it's farm fish always have more lice on them than the wild fish. I think I can get around that. Susceptibility issues between Chum and Atlantic, etc. And then the production cycle that plays a role on the farm. But despite the high levels on farm fish, those really high aspects on farm fish, it's not showing up on the wild fish. Okay, so I wanted to look at life stage and how that transfers over. And if we look at 3 farms in Esperanza Farm itself, Hecate and Steamer, we have a lot of motiles that are not transferring or developing into adult females with eggs. And that's probably due to treatment, that's probably due to loss, but there were no adult females on, there was two fish that had adult females on them. They don't show up on the graph. We've got adult females with eggs, they're not showing up on the farm fish. So there doesn't seem to be a direct transfer. Having adult females on your farm fish does not translate into getting them onto your wild fish. In Jervis, by comparison, I had to put in this one all stages of on the wild fish, which are in blue, because there were no adult fish. There were no adult sea lice on wild fish, so I included them all. And in those cases, what it shows out is that there's no adult females found, even though there were on the wild fish, and in years with no farm fish, there's still lice on those fish. So again, there's no clear pattern. And the abundance levels fall within that limit that we were talking about. Okay, so what is those source? It's really unlikely that it's not due to the farm fish, because the life stages are mainly copeptids and chalamus, not adults, females or adult males on the wild fish. So I don't know where those come from. It's obviously there, but it doesn't look like that the farms are the source of it. They could be the source of nauplii and copeptids. Okay. Now, how long are they by the farms? You got to look this site up because it's really cool. They tagged fish up here in Chilco Lake and then caught them on radio receivers, that's the yellow dots, between the entrance to Discovery and the exit to the Johnson Straits, and they passed right by the farms. 25 kilometers a day, 1.3 body lengths per second, average transit time of 40 hours, 7 minutes near a given farm. So 70 minutes in total. What we don't know is what that plume is around the salmon farms. That's the unknown there. So these fish are really motoring through these sites. Look it up, it's pretty fun. Discovery Islands. In 2019, they were intercepted before they went into Discovery Islands from the Strait of Georgia, and they ended up with 0.56 lice per fish. After the farms, it was 0.23. So that took a few days looking at the data. I was able to surmise that based on the weight of the fish, that they were probably coming out of those inlets, and they were yet to be infected. So it diluted that big pool of data. Secondly, was that if in 2020, when there was no farms, no difference between entering it and leaving it. Okay, so we know that those background levels are pretty high for those fish at that point. Then on the salmon farms from the treatment, there's that level of 3. This is during the month of migration. We have a treatment, boom, down to nothing. Back up pretty quick in that, boom, and then back up again. So these treatments are within the life cycle stage of adults. So it's unlikely that, and the adults' counts on these fish were 0. So it's unlikely that they're internal infection themselves. So we don't know where they're coming from. It's coming from external. So I went and checked the historic data to see if there was lice counts on fish before Atlantic salmon arrived. Were they really the culprit? And if there was any infection on any other non-target species, that they were specific to the hosts. It turns out that the hosts include Pacific sandlance, white sturgeon, lingcod, three-spine stickleback, and some other things. But a really neat thing that happened was that Lance, back in 2004, had to survey all of the fish he caught in the net. And he found that there were non-target species with abundance levels of 5 for the Powell perch, which eats sea lice, and on others. So really what we don't get is we don't get a sense of whether or not there's a role of farm fish as the only ones that are the source of that. So coming out to the conclusions, I threw this slide in there to say that even when bags were used around farms, levels were really low. They were always to background. And what they've been doing is treating fish before the migration to keep those levels at 1, which a number of authors agree that if you do that, the production of eggs is very low. So it coincides with or agrees with the data in the literature. So migratory chum salmon are infested with lice as soon as they get into seawater. I couldn't show you those data, but you can track it by size, that they're infected very quickly. Larger fish have more lice, that makes sense. Some fish are really lousy, we see those pictures, but when we take into account the lice species and the number of lice that are on farm fish, it's really improbable that they're the source of the lice transfer, that they're probably the source of the generation of nauplii and copeptids, and that farm salmon become reinfested early after treatment. It indicates that there's an external source or reservoir of adult lice that's not completely by farm salmon. So in that sense, the paradigm falls short of it, but we still need to look at, and it doesn't excuse sea lice management practices have to be improved. So I know that was a rush and had to speak quickly, but thank you very much. I really appreciate it.